And let's pick up with the third chapter of Over Sea Under Stone. Simon, Barney, and Jane have found a hidden attic in the gray house that they're staying in. And in that hidden attic, they have found a map, which Simon has pointed out has the name of King Arthur and the name of King Mark of Cornwall on it. And it is written in Latin. We'll pick up from there. "Gosh," said Simon, "I think he's right. It must be that. I bet old King Mark left some treasure behind somewhere, and that's why there's a map. Suppose we find it. We'd be rich, we'd be famous." "We shall have to tell Mother and Father," Jane said. The two boys stopped thumping each other ecstatically and looked at her. "Whatever for?" "Well," Jane said lamely, taken aback, "I suppose we ought to, that's all." Barney sat back on his heels again, frowning, and rifled his fingers through his hair, which by now looked several shades darker than it had when they came up to the attic. "I wonder what they'd say." "I know what they'd say," Simon said promptly. "They'd say it was all our imagination, and anyway, they'd tell us to put the manuscript back where we found it because it isn't ours." "Well," Jane said, "it isn't, is it? It's a treasure trove, finders keepers, findings keepings. But we found it in someone else's house. It belongs to the captain. You know what Mother said about not touching anything." "She said anything that was put away. This wasn't put away. It was just chucked down in a corner." "I found it," Barney said. "It was all forgotten and dusty. I bet you anything the captain hadn't a clue it was there." "Oh, honestly, Jane," Simon said, "you can't find a treasure map and just say, 'Oh, how nice,' and put it back again, and that's what they'd make us do." "Oh, well," said Jane doubtfully, "I suppose you're right. We can always put it back afterwards." Barney had turned the manuscript again. "Hey," he said, "look at this top part, the old manuscript that's stuck down on the parchment. What's it made of? I thought it was parchment on the outside bit, but when you look properly it isn't. And it's not paper either. It's some funny thick stuff. It's hard, like wood." He touched an edge of the strange brown surface gingerly with a finger. "Be careful," Jane said nervously. "It might crumble away into dust before our eyes or something." "I suppose you'd still want to go showing everyone even then," Simon said acidly. "Look what we've found. Does it matter if we touch it and show them a little heap of dust in a matchbox?" Jane said nothing. "Oh, well, never mind," said Simon, relenting. She meant well, after all. "Hey, it's getting awfully dark up here. Do you think we ought to go down? They'll be looking for us soon. Mother will have stopped painting." "It is getting late." Jane looked round the attic and shivered suddenly. The big echoing room was growing dark, and there was a dismal sound now to the rain faintly tapping on the glass. Back in their bedrooms, the boys' wardrobe pushed in again. To hide the small secret door, they washed and changed hurriedly, as the curt clang of the ship's bell calling them to supper echoed up the stairs. Simon changed his dusty shirt, rolling the clean one into a crumpled ball before he put it on, and hoping no one would notice it was fresh. There was not very much they could do about Barney's hair, now khaki. "It's like what Mother says about the rug in the living room at home," Jane said in despair, trying to brush out the dust while her brother wriggled in protest. "It shows every mark." "Perhaps we ought to wash it." Simon peered at Barney critically. "No," Barney said. "Oh, well, there isn't time really anyway. I'm hungry. You'll just have to sit away from the light." But when they were all sitting round the supper table, it soon became clear that no one was going to ask questions about where they had been. The evening began as one of those times when everything seemed determined to go wrong. Mother looked tired and depressed and did not say much. Signs they knew, and that her day's painting had not been a success. Father, gloomy after the gray day, erupted into wrath when Rufus bounced in, dripping from his walk, and banished him to the kitchen with Mrs. Polk. And Great-Uncle Mary had come in silent and thoughtful, mysteriously brooding. He sat at one end of the table alone, staring into the middle distance like a great carved totem pole. The children eyed him warily, and took care to pass him the salt before he had to ask. But Great-Uncle Mary scarcely seemed to see them. He ate automatically, picking up his food and guiding it to his mouth without taking the slightest notice of it. Barney wondered for a wistful moment What would happen if he were to slip a cork table mat to his great-uncle's plate? Mrs. Polk came in with an enormous apple tart and a dish of mounded yellow cream, and clattered the dirty plates into a pile. She went out down the hall, and they heard the rich rolling contralto of "O God, our help in ages past," echoing into the distance. Father sighed. "There are times," he said irritably, "when I could dispense with devotions at every meal." "The Cornish," boomed Great-Uncle Mary from the shadows, "are a devout and evangelical people." "I dare say," said Father. He passed Simon the cream. Simon helped himself to a large spoonful, and a yellow blob dropped from the spoon to the tablecloth. "Oh, Simon," Mother said, "do look what you're doing." "I couldn't help it. It just fell." "That comes of trying to take too much at once," Father said. "Well, you like it too." "Possibly, but I don't try to transport a quart in a pint pot." "What do you mean?" "Never mind," Father said. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Simon, you're just making it worse." Simon, in an attempt to retrieve the blob of cream with his spoon, had left a large yellow smear on the cloth. "Sorry." "I should think so." "Did you go fishing today, Father?" Jane asked hopefully from across the table, feeling that it was time to change the subject. "No," Father said. "Don't be stupid," Simon said ungratefully, still smarting. "It was raining." "Well, Father does go fishing in the rain sometimes." "No, he doesn't." "Yes, he does." "If I may be allowed to explain my own actions," Father said with heavy sarcasm, "occasionally I have been known to go fishing in the rain. Today I did not. Is that comprehensible?" "Have some apple tart, dear," Mother said, handing him a plate. Father said, glancing at her sideways, and he lapsed into silence. After a moment he said hopefully, "Might be an idea if we all went for a walk after supper. It seems to be clearing up." Everyone looked out the window, and the temperature of the room rose several degrees. Over the sea the clouds had broken, leaving a deepening blue sky, and the opposite headland glowed suddenly a brighter green as the sinking sun shone for the first time that day. Then they heard the doorbell ring. "Bother," said Mother wearily. "Whoever can that be?" Mrs. Polk's footsteps rang briskly past the door, and then back again. She put her head in. "'Tis some people for you, Dr. Drew." "Stand by to repeal borders," Father said, and he went out into the hall. In a few moments he was back, talking to someone over his shoulder as he came through the door. "Very kind of you indeed. We hadn't really thought what we were going to do tomorrow. They're an independent lot, you know. Well, here we are." He beamed heartily round the family. He beamed heartily round with what the family called his public face. "My wife, Simon, Jane, Bonnie, and this is Mr. and Miss Withers, from that yacht you admire so much, Simon. We met in the harbor this morning." A man and a girl stood behind him in the doorway. Both were dark-haired, with beaming smiles, bright and sun-tanned faces. They looked like beings suddenly materialized from another very tidy planet. The man stepped forward, holding out his hand. "How do you do, Miss Drew?" Mrs. Drew. As they sat staring blankly at him as he advanced toward Mother. They sat staring blankly at him as he advanced toward Mother. He wore dazzlingly white flannel trousers and a blazer, with a dark blue scarf tucked in the neck, and his white shirt. And they had not expected to see anything like him in Treswick at all. Then they all jumped hastily as Mother stood to shake hands, and Simon knocked over his chair. Into the confusion, Mrs. Polk appeared with a large teapot and a tray of cups and saucers. "2 extra cups," she said, smiling blandly, and departed again. "Do sit down," the girl said. "We only popped in for a moment. We didn't want to interrupt." She bent to help Simon pick up his chair. Her black curls bobbed forward over her forehead. She was a very pretty girl, Jane thought, watching her. Much older than any of them, of course. She wore a bright green shirt and black trousers, and her eyes seemed to twinkle with a kind of hidden private laughter. Jane suddenly felt extremely young. Mr. Withers, showing a lot of very white teeth, was talking to Mother. "Mrs. Drew, do please forgive this intrusion. We had no intention of breaking into your supper." "Not at all," said Mother, looking faintly bemused. "Won't you have a cup of tea?" "Thank you. No, most kind. But we have a meal waiting on the boat. We simply came to issue an invitation. My sister and I are in Treswick for some days with the yacht to ourselves on our way round the coast, and we wondered whether you and the children would care to spend a day out at sea. We have—" "Gosh!" said Simon, nearly upset his chair again. "How marvellous! You mean go out on that fabulous boat?" "I do indeed," said the smiling Mr. Withers. Simon spluttered without words, his face glowing with delight. Mother said hesitantly, "Well, of course I realize we're descending on you out of the blue," Mr. Withers said soothingly, "but it would be pleasant to have company for a change, and when we met your husband in the harbour master's office this morning and discovered we were neighbours in London—" "Are you?" Barney said curiously from the table. "Where?" "Marylebone High Street, just round the corner from you." "Marylebone High Street, just round the corner from you," said the girl, dimpling at him. "Norman sells antiques." She looked across at Mother. "I expect you and I use the same shops, Mrs. Drew. You know that little passetière where you can get those gorgeous rum babas?" "I try not to," Mother said, beginning to smile. "Well, really, this is very kind, considering we're strangers, but I'm not sure whether, well, the three of them could be rather a handful, you know." "Mother!" Simon looked aghast. Mr. Withers puckered his nose boyishly at her. "But my invitation extends to the whole family, Mrs. Drew. We sincerely hope you and your husband will join our little crew as well. Just a trip out and back, you understand, round the bay, as the commercial gentlemen have it, with perhaps a little fishing. I shall enjoy showing off the boat. Tomorrow, perhaps? They say it should be a fine day." "What an old-fashioned way of talking he has," Jane thought idly. "Perhaps it comes of selling antiques." She looked at Simon and Barney, both all eagerness at the idea of a day on the strange yacht, gazing anxiously at their parents, and then back at Mr. Withers' immaculate white flannels and folded scarf. "I don't like him," she thought. "I wonder why." Well, thank you very much indeed," Mother said finally. "I don't think I shall come, if you'll forgive me. If the sun comes out, I shall go and work up above the harbour, but I know Dick and the children would love to go." "Ah, yes, Dr. Drew was telling me about your painting," Mr. Withers said warmly. "Well, the loss will be ours, but if the muse calls, dear lady, the rest of the family will come, though, I hope." "Not half," said Simon swiftly. "It sounds smashing," Barney said. He added with an afterthought, "Thank you very much." "Well," said Father cheerfully, "this is a noble gesture, I must say. We're all very grateful to you. As a matter of fact," he looked vaguely round the room, "there should have been one other member of my family here, but he seems to have disappeared. My wife's uncle. He rented the house for us." The children automatically followed his gaze round the room. They had forgotten Great-Uncle Mary. Now they realized that there had been no sign of him since the two sudden visitors appeared. The door that led into the breakfast room at the back of the house stood slightly open, but when Barney ran across to look in, there was no one there. "Professor Lyon, you mean?" the girl said. "That's right," Father said, staring at her a moment. "I didn't think I mentioned him this morning. Do you know him, then?" Mr. Withers answered for her quickly and smoothly. "I believe we have met once or twice in another sphere than this. In the course of our work, you know. A charming old gentleman, as I remember, but a little unpredictable." "That he certainly is," Mother said ruefully, "always dashing off somewhere. He hasn't even finished his supper this time. But do let me give you some tea or coffee." "Thank you, but I think we should be getting back," the girl said. "Vane will have supper waiting." Mr. Withers pulled down the edges of his immaculate blazer with a precise feminine gesture. "You're quite right, Polly. We mustn't be late." He swung his white smile round the room like a lighthouse. "Vane is our skipper, the professional on board, and an excellent chef, too. You must sample his cooking tomorrow. Well now, shall we see you all down in the harbour? If the weather is fine, 9:30 perhaps. We will have the dinghy waiting at the quay, and we will pause there."